misconceptions, right, about forgiving, okay? So the first one is that, that we should always forgive and then forget, right? And so what I hope that you don't walk away thinking is that the point of this is to teach you to forgive and then forget and let everything go. There's certain conditions that must be met so that you're safe and so that psychologically it's helpful, and it's not just about trying to quickly let go of stuff. That's been significant, okay? And then it's not about trying to just pass over the transgressor's offenses like they never happened, okay? So it's not about that, okay? And then another misconception is that you could forgive on behalf of another person. So, you know, so if my mother's been hurt by someone, that I could forgive the offender on my mother's behalf. No, it has to come from the actual person that was harmed. Okay. So, all right. So then what is forgiveness? Okay, so it's granting of a pardon. And then it's a decision that you want to move beyond your resentment. You don't want to stay stuck in that state of resenting. Okay? And it's primarily an internal process that happens inside of you. You decide that you want to do this. Okay? And then once you make that decision, then it involves dialogue where you have a conversation with the person and you let them know that you're going to forgive them. And often it comes after there's an apology or something else maybe. And these kinds of official dialogues or mediations that can happen, sometimes they're called restorative dialogues. That's a place where that it typically happens in those kinds of situations. Okay? So according to Dr. Everett Washington, who writes about this sort of thing, okay, so forgiveness is replacement of negative, unforgiving emotions by positive, other-oriented emotions, like feeling empathy or sympathy for the person, compassion, agape, or even romantic love. So it can happen in all sorts of relationships, and then you feel connected. What you saw in the video was that person who committed the crime actually formed a relationship with the person. And that's actually not uncommon with these youth offender, victim offender programs. The people have a conversation. I know in another case where this young man broke into his next door neighbor's house and stole the TV. Okay, and he got busted, and then he was arrested, but he went into that, and he ended up becoming friends with this. It was an old man that lived there. He became friends and started doing chores for the guy that he couldn't do himself anymore because of his age. He had become somewhat disabled. So they actually formed a relationship. Sometimes what comes out of these is that people try to repair the harm by doing something to make up for the negative thing that they did. So that's called restitution, when you actually do something. So it could be the chores started out as a way to give back to the person for having taken something away. So he did chores, and then it became a relationship where they became friends, and then he did regularly do things for the old man that lived next door that needed some help. And then he had another person to talk to, so it's a win-win. He gets something out of it, you know. So sometimes young people commit crimes because they're not getting enough attention, is what I learned. Working in the juvenile detention facilities, there were tons of kids in there just starving for attention. So.
What did you do?
What was my role there?
Yeah.
I actually taught conflict resolution in juvenile detention facilities. I also taught it at Denver Women's Prison. So same story. I mean, all these people, like, there's such sad stories why they're there. Okay. So like having them come into these classes and having conversations and letting them talk about what matters, letting them talk about their conflicts and feeling like people are listening to them, that would just really change their behavior. Like, they would really get into these classes on conflict resolution. So the challenge of being able to forgive is that we have to remember in a living way that serves us in our families and in our communities. It can be very, very hard to forgive around atrocities and acts of war or, slavery, for example, horrible, horrible thing that is part of our history and so on. So it can be hard to forgive for those things. It can take some internal work to literally feel like you want to forgive somebody after those kinds of things, okay? And then the other thing is that you want to remember things that happened, but remember it in a way that it's not where you're continually suffering because you're reliving the negative experience. So how can you remember and not re-experience the pain and also not get into feeling like you want revenge and continuing the cycle? Yeah. So those are challenges. That's not easy. Has anyone ever listened to talks with Holocaust survivors? Yeah. So those are people that have a lot to offer to teach us about this, and other people who have survived wars. Okay. Now, is it appropriate to withhold forgiveness? And the answer is yes. Okay. So if you're been hurt by somebody and further contact will just lead to more hurt or harm, then you don't want to continue a relationship with that person or even let them know that you forgive them, right? So if you don't want to, you're right. You don't never have to forgive and relate to a person that you don't want to, okay? That's your total right. And if you don't feel like the person deserves it, if you think that this person is really just going to continue doing this, or that they really don't care, that there's things about their behavior that show you that they don't deserve to be forgiven, then that would be a case where it would be okay, all right? So people should genuinely be remorseful. They should communicate their taking responsibility for their behavior and a serious intention to change, and not something superficial or ingenuous, right? And you should feel safe, okay? There is a terrible problem with people in abusive relationships where the person who is the perpetrator, who does violence, then apologizes, gives flowers, and then all is forgiven. They have makeup sex, and then it happens all over again, and it's a cycle, and it just keeps on happening over and over again. And it's a terrible thing, and it's hard to break out of. So it's equally important that people recognize when the person is not going to change, and when maybe even you need some outside help to get out of those kind of negative cycles again. Okay. So conditions for forgiving, okay? So when is it okay? So first of all, you know that it's safe to forgive, okay? That you feel strong enough to forgive that person, you're not still in a lot of pain or grief over what happened, that you're healed from the situation. That's when it's appropriate. So what Brian was saying about venting and having your emotions and being acknowledged for all the pain that you have, that's an important part of the process. And once you're through that, then you can move on when you feel safe and strong that you can actually forgive at that point. Okay. So some factors, okay. Sometimes people feel like it's necessary for there to be justice before they can forgive. So, in the case right now, we have a movement for restitution because of slavery, yeah? And some people, they really want to see that happen, and that would actually be a really good thing, because the research shows that people whose families were enslaved are behind economically compared to families that haven't had that situation, yeah? So that makes sense. So that's an example of how maybe there needs to be justice. Something has to happen where a person pays for their crime or pays for their injustice or pays for what they did, or at least does something to try to balance the scales when things have become unequal because of the situation, yeah, okay? And so this is true at personal and as well as at the social level, right? So if somebody does something negative to you, you might want them to have to pay for their negative acts towards you before you're willing to forgive them, yeah? So it can be personal or on a societal level that people want that. Okay. Some more factors, okay. So some people can only forgive after they feel like there's some kind of reciprocity that has taken place, and they want to make sure that they can recover their dignity, their freedom, their sense of safety and whatever, maybe if there was property involved, if their property was stolen or damaged or something, that gets replaced before they want to forgive. And that's okay to want those things. There's nothing wrong with that. Okay? It's common. Okay? So, if you're in a community that believes in forgiving, it's easier to forgive if you're raised that way. And there's a lot of different communities that believe in this. Some are religious or spiritual, and other times it's just around people being humanistic and caring about other people. Okay. Religious values, most religions do preach that forgiveness is a good thing to do. Okay. And then there's leaders that have influenced people to be open to forgiving. Okay. And some of the things that to bear in mind around why forgiveness can be really helpful is that when one is particularly responsive to the network of social relations, one may forgive to maintain that web of humanity so that we can restore peace when their peace is broken, yeah? And then to try to promote this as an ethical principle. So there's lots of people doing work in peace building and reconciliation. There's been religious organizations doing it for years, but there's also lots of secular organizations that are doing this and promoting this to try to restore communities and to try to end the immense amount of violence that's on our planet. Okay. All right. Now, people who create meaning from their suffering can find ways to move past it. And there's a really good example. There's a book called Man's Search for Meaning. Has anybody read that book? Maybe for a class? Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. So he was a concentration camp survivor who did a lot of crazy things to survive being in that situation. And then he wrote a book about that experience. So that's the book, Man's Search for Meaning. And he found that the people who survived were the people who felt like it was important for them to survive and live and tell their children and their grandchildren what happened so this could never happen again. That was the meaning for them. He found that. And he became a psychologist, and he invented a kind of therapy called logotherapy, where people make meaning about their experiences and then are able to move past them. Yeah, so he's made some pretty valuable contributions in that respect. And another forgiveness factor is, as I said earlier, forgiveness and apologies can help to create empathy. So that helps us to have more compassion for other people. Okay. So I think here it's actually Viktor Frankl, who I just told you about. Okay. Does anyone know who Nelson Mandela is? Yeah? Do you want to say anything about him?
I don't really know like the whole story about him, but I just know that he was put in jail and then like basically wrongly put in jail.
Well, he was, okay, so he came from South Africa, and they had the apartheid system, which was extreme separation between blacks and whites, and they had to live in these really bad situations, these ghettos, and they weren't allowed to come out of their ghettos, and they just had jobs with, they had permission to go into the white communities if they had a job there, and they had some horrible jobs that some of them did, working in mines and this and that, or working as servants, and it basically really kept them oppressed. I mean, it's like 10 times worse, or maybe 100 times worse than segregation. So he was a freedom fighter to end apartheid, and that's why he was a political prisoner for 20 years. And he survived that, and then he wanted to move on. So after apartheid ended, he was released from prison, and he was voted president. And what he wanted to do was to have reconciliation between the black and white communities, bring people together. And they started doing dialogues, restorative justice dialogues, where the people who were the victims, the black South Africans, would talk about their experiences under apartheid, and white people would be there and listen and apologize for what they had done. And that helped to rebuild communities and bring people together and help them to get past what had happened. And it was so successful in South Africa that they did the same thing in Rwanda. And in Rwanda, there was a massive genocide where they were divided into two groups of people, and they were both indigenous to Rwanda. It was the Tutsis and the Hutus, and they had a long history of not getting along. And then the Tutsis were in power, and they had been oppressing the Hutus, so the Hutus decided to get revenge, and they just started slaughtering people. And these were people that could have been next door neighbors to each other. They lived in the same communities next door to each other, and then the Hutus organized and slaughtered Tutsis. It's like massive amounts of them, right? And so after that, those people did get arrested that were involved in it, and a lot of them went to prison, but they decided that they wanted to rebuild the communities and restore what harmony had been there before all these acts of violence. And they used the same processes as they were used in South Africa. So South Africa's restorative dialogues became a model for other people to use. Another place where I know it's being used is in cases of domestic violence. And Linda Mills, who is actually a provost at NYU University, she did a lot of research on it. She was a social worker, and then she went to law school, and she was very interested in trying to end domestic violence. And through her research, she found out that when you just arrest a man, throw him in jail, separate the couple, throw the man in jail, punish him, make him make amends, and then just try to empower the women, that wasn't very effective. And because a lot of women who've been abused don't want their husbands to go to jail, they won't testify, or they don't even report it, and so on. So she said it's not working. So they found out that if you use restorative dialogues, you can actually help to rebuild the couple's relationship and find out some of the sources of the violence. And you bring in a social worker to be the mediator, and then each person in the couple chooses people from their families or communities to be there in these circles, and they have conversations about what happened, and then they have conversations how to prevent it from ever happening again, and how to get support, and how to get along in a cooperative and loving manner. And it's been, the research is showing that it's more effective than just arresting the abuser and sending him to jail. And I did say men, because 90% of the violence is by men, but the other 10% is by women and gay men against other men, yeah. But 90% is heterosexual men abusing their wives or their girlfriends, yeah. Yeah, so even in those situations, it can be used to help to change the relationships and get people back on track. Okay. Now, my mother is a survivor of World War II. My grandmother was killed by the Germans. A bomb dropped and fell between the houses, the house, my mom's family's house and the neighbor's house. The bomb fell. My grandmother was in the kitchen. The broken glass from the kitchen window and the shrapnel hit her. And within 24 hours, she was dead. And the Nazis, they not only, bombed them, but they occupied Greece. They took all their food. My mother and her family were basically starving. My uncles, who were younger than her, were going around and picking through trash in the houses where the Nazis were occupying. Their officers would move into a person's house. They would find a person who was more affluent, move into their house, make them into their servants, and have food there, and have them, the people who lived there, cook for them. That's what they did. Can you imagine somebody moving into your house that's occupying your country and it's like killing your people, and now they're living in your house and you have to be their servant? Can you imagine that? That's what they did. So my mother lived through that, and my uncles were starving, and she totally forgave the Nazis. And she said, well, that's what was going on. They couldn't help themselves, that's what their leader did or whatever. And she's totally forgiven, and she's like this peaceful, calm person, right? My dad lived in Denmark, and the Nazis also invaded, but they didn't want to, they were trying to get the Danes on their side because they saw them as being similar to them. They thought they were part of the Aryan race, and they were blonde haired like them and blue eyes, so they wanted them on their side, so they didn't do the atrocities to the Danes. that they did to the Greeks and other people and the Poles and other people around the world. Yeah. They treated the Danes better, but my father held on to that anger against Germans for years and years and years. And he'd meet a German and he would insult them, you know? And it would just be like, whoa, like, you know, like that guy didn't do anything to you. He wasn't even alive during the war. Why you treat him that way, you know? But he held on to that bitterness and that anger and that rage, you know, for a good part of his life. Towards the very, very end of his life, he met a camera repairman on this little camera shop and found out he was German, and he was like, wow, he's a really nice guy. I guess the Germans aren't so bad anymore, you know, since the war's over, you know, it took him like 50 years to get over it, whereas my mother forgave him right after the war. It's an amazing, amazing person. So, yeah. So, okay, a word of caution, all right? Okay, so before trusting a transgressor, look for a change in behavior. So just because someone apologizes, still be sure that they're not going to repeat that negative behavior, okay? And then look out for manipulation from repeat offenders. Like I said, it's common for abusers to give flowers and then abuse you again. So if there's repeat behavior, that's a time to get away from that person, not re-engage and project or create a possibility where you can be hurt again, okay? And remember that you have the power to choose whether you want to forgive or not, okay? And you must guard and retain that power that you have to make a decision about when it's a good time to forgive or not, okay? All right, I'm going to stop here because we're almost at the end. But we're almost at one anyway. You have 1 minute left. You can feel liberated when you forgive somebody and free. And if your mind stops being stuck in a cycle of negativity and bitterness, that can be very, very freeing. Okay? All right. So today's Wednesday. I will see you on Monday. We're talking about. Oh, I'm sorry. I will see you for a week. See you a week from today. Okay. And that's when we'll get into the third-party interventions and mediation. Okay. All right.